I am stretched upon your grave and will lie there forever if your hands were in mine. I'd be sure they'd not sever.
Hey everyone, Clawland here, and welcome to another episode of Left Hand Review. This is episode 7, and we're going to take a look at Labyrinth, the War on Terror. Labyrinth is a 1 to 2 player game that pits the jihad against the United States forces in a fight against terrorism. In the 1 player variant, you actually are the US force, and the game's AI plays as the jihad. The game takes about 3 hours, though there is some adjustment to that. Depending on the number of times you cycle through the deck, which alludes to the fact that this is a card-driven war game. And it's more in the vein of Twilight Struggle rather than a giant hex map chip-pushing marathon like a lot of the other war games out there. It was designed by Volko Ruhnke and is published by GMT Games. So what I'm going to do is open up the box, show you what's inside. I'm going to go over the board and the counters and the components, the cards, tell you a little bit about the mechanics of the game, and then I'll go into a rules overview. I may not touch every single rule in the game because that would take forever, as Undead Viking calls it, a ridiculously long rules overview. So let's take a look at it, and then I'll tell you what I think. Labyrinth comes in a standard GMT-sized wargame box, but the box itself is a very, very thick cardboard. It's very, very structurally sound, and it just makes it feel a lot more substantial. Inside the box, we have the rule book, which isn't too bad. It's full color, but mostly walls of text with some pictures in there. And actually, the main rules only go to right here, page 11, and then starting on page 12 are the 1 player instructions. And we also have a glossary and index at the back, so it's really not too bad. Here we have the U.S. operations cheat sheet. This tells you all the operations that the U.S. player can take. It's double-sided. Here we have the jihadist cheat sheet, which again tells all the actions that the jihadist player can take and is double-sided. And actually on the inside of these is a flow chart that is the AI for the 1 player game. So when you're playing 2 players, you'll never have to open it up and look at this. But in the 1 player game, this is a very simple flow chart about what happens on the jihad player's turn, in other words, in the AI. So if they draw a certain card, what happens, and you just follow this down. It's very, very simple, and after you do it a few times, you have this all memorized anyway. So it's really neat that they have that. This is just a cheat sheet I printed out from BGG. It has some of the cards and the rules that the cards refer to, so in case I need to check back in the rule book for anything. We have the playbook. This was awesome because this is actually one of the first war games I got from GMT, and I was a little nervous about getting into wargaming, and this is just exceptional. It takes you through the first couple turns of the game card by card and explains how the game works. And not only does it tell you how it works, but it tells you why the player may have done this, what their thinking was. So not really enough to give you a solid strategy to go on per se, but it's not just telling you do this, put this chit here, play this card here. It tells you kind of the reasoning behind that. And that's in full color. There's also this nice couple pages at the end here, guide for operations. So for the US player, just some general overall questions you may have, like how do I raise the US prestige again? So instead of trying to thumb through the rule book, this will tell you a quick blurb about, oh yeah, that's how I raise prestige. And for the jihadist player, the same thing. So how do I scare off aid, or how do I turn a US ally into a neutral or adversary? So again, It's a great way to jog your memory on certain things, and if you still need help, then you can go right back to the rule book. Then you have some design notes from the designer Volko, which is pretty neat. Talks about how he designed the game. And what's also great, if you're into the background of the cards, this gives a historical background of each of the cards in the game and why they were designed the way they were designed, and a little bit background on the events that they're based on. So, very, very well done. We have the, of course, clarifications in errata. There aren't very many. This is another cheat sheet that I printed off of BGG. It is exceptional. It kind of helps you, it's kind of in addition to the other cheat sheets that came with the game, but it helps you tell which actions the Jihad player and the US player can take. So in case you have any questions. And it tells you also the prerequisites for all of the actions that you can take and the exact procedure, which is a little bit more in-depth than the included player aid. So this is nice to reference, especially when you're new to the game. And here's the good stuff, the board. This is a mounted map board, the GMT 8-panel boards that they've been getting heavy into, and I'll unfold that when we get a little bit more into it. Oh, my cards, which have gone everywhere here, but there's a lot of cards in this game, which is nice, and I have them all sleeved, so let me pull them out and show you the stack here. So these are the cards. You can tell it's a really big stack. And there are 3 types of cards. There are your unassociated event cards here that do not have any symbol in the top. You have your Jihad events, which have the Jihad symbol at the top. And you also have your US events, which will have the US symbol on the top. And let's see if I can find one here. Ah, there we go. There's a US event. You can also tell because the op number here is kind of in a tan box. On the Jihad it's in a green, and the unassociated events are in the gray. And that's important because in this game you're going to be playing cards, because this is a card-driven war game, alternating impulses. And if you happen to be a US player and you play a Jihad event card because you need to use the ops points, and I'll explain what all that means, that jihadist event will trigger. And likewise, when the Jihad player plays a US associated card, the US event will trigger. So it's really a lot of tough decisions in this game because of that aspect. And there's a mechanic for each side in which they can avoid one card of the opposing player's event from triggering. And I'll get more into that when I explain the game. We have 4 dice here. 3 dice are used for the jihadist player and 1 for the US player. We have some counters here. Some additional counters. These are for the events. So when you have events that take place that are that last for at least a turn or can last for the rest of the game, you can put these out as a reminder to those events. These are the US troop cubes. These are the cubes that represent the US troops, and you're going to be moving these from country to country. You have your jihadist cells. Face down, these are sleeper cells, and they have a really neat graphic on the other side, a glossy jihadist symbol here. So when the sleeper cells are awakened, you flip them over to this side to indicate that. Very nice box insert, and I hate getting rid of inserts, especially ones that have some artwork on them. So there's a lot more components, so I actually had to store them underneath the insert. So let's pull that out. So I have this nifty little token holder here. I actually got this at a little Japanese store when I was living in Los Angeles. So let's take a quick look here. There's all sorts of counters in here. You can kind of see them through the plastic, and I'll go over those in a minute. Labyrinth comes with 4 different scenarios that you can set the game up with. So I use the first one, the beginner one, which is Let's Roll. And here you can see the board completely set up for that scenario. So I'm just going to go through and explain the different parts of the board and what they mean, and then I'll start to touch on some of the rules. So down here I have all the counters that I showed you earlier in the little containers opened up. I have a deck of cards here. Over here we have the markers for various events. And we have the dice here as well. So the first thing I'll point out is some card boxes here. You have 2 lapsing event boxes, which are used for when an event is played that lasts for a turn. You put them here in the lapsing events box. And you also have your first plot box. Now I mentioned earlier that when you play a card of the opposing faction or team, so to speak, that is triggered. But one of the actions that the jihad player can take is plot, which is a terror plot. And the first card that they use to plot a terror plot, they put into this box. And the card that they use, if it happens to be an American event, it ignores the event. So that is the way that the jihadist player can ignore one U.S. event. Now, of course, this is a jihadist event, so that example didn't really make sense. But if I had placed an American event card there, say this, as the jihad player, I would ignore this event. On the board here you see many different regions, most of them being countries or groups of countries. So let's take a look at the Gulf states here. In the Gulf states here you will see that there are 2 cubes. These are the troops cubes, and in this particular scenario it starts with 2 troops. The oil derrick symbol here, or oil pump, indicates that this is an oil-producing nation, and there's a card or a couple of cards in which that may come into effect. You also see the dark green background with the white crescent moon, and that indicates that this is a Shia mix Muslim country, as opposed to some of the other ones that have a white background and a dark green. You can see Central Asia here has the white background, and this is a Sunni Muslim country. You know that a country is Muslim versus non-Muslim because all the Muslim countries have this track here, this alignment track. So let's go back down to the Gulf states. The alignment is indicated as either an ally, neutral, or adversary. So in game terms, let me just read from the glossary what alignment means, because they say it best. Alignment is a rough characterization of how closely a country's governance is apt to work with the U.S. in the struggle against jihadism. So it can move either way during the course of the game for each country. Jihadist player obviously is going to be wanting to move it towards adversary, whereas the U.S. player is going to be moving it towards ally. You also have this marker here. These markers go from good, fair, poor, and then Islamist rule. And these markers are the governance level. Governance is a rough characterization of the representativeness and efficiency of a government as good, fair, poor, or Islamist rule. So in other words, the jihadist player is going to be wanting to push towards adversary and towards Islamist rule, whereas the American player is going to be wanting to push towards ally and a good rule. You can also see that there's a 3 here. This is the supply level, the resource level of a particular country, and that is a victory condition of the game, and I'll go over that when we get to the victory conditions. Now you can see the non-Islamist countries, such as India here, are indicated with a star symbol. And they don't have that alignment and governance track, they simply have a posture. And posture is indicated with these posture markers, which are either soft or hard, which is their stance on terrorism. So either a hard stance or a soft stance. Up at the top here we have the troops track and the jihadist funding track. So in the troops track there are 3 boxes. There's the low intensity box, the war box, and the overstretch box. And you have this little troop marker here that will move depending on how many troops there are. So this marker will stand in the box farthest to the left that has fewer than 5 troops in it. So as troops are deployed on the board, let's say these two are deployed, this box now has fewer than 5 troops, so the marker moves here to the war box. Why does that matter? Well, that will determine how many cards a player draws at the beginning of their turn. So when your troops are in the low intensity box, you draw a hand of 9 cards. If you're in the war box at the beginning of the turn, you draw 8 cards, and if you're in the overstretch box, you draw only 7 cards. So while you want to have troops on the board to do various events, you also have to balance that against the fact that you will draw fewer cards and thus have likely fewer events that you can take each turn. Similarly, we can look at the jihadist funding track, which operates similarly, only sort of backwards. So in the jihadist funding track here, they can deploy their jihadist cells onto the board. And there's a funding marker here, which right now is sitting at the funding of 9. Depending on where the jihadist funding marker is, determines how many cards the jihadist player draws on the beginning of their turn. So in the ample funding box, they draw 9 cards. In the moderate funding, 8 cards, and in the tight funding, 7 cards. So as they complete plots and as the U.S. player fights against them, this is going to move down. Another thing about the jihadist player is that when funding, or they can only deploy cells from a box that is equal to or to the left of the funding track. So as opposed to the troops track, where you can deploy as many troops as you want, and the number of troops deployed is what determines which box you're in, the funding track works a little bit differently. So as funding goes down, you reduce the number of cards you can take and the number of cells that you can deploy. So say your funding was here at 6, you cannot deploy any of the cards or any of the cells in the ample funding box. So if you deployed all these here, you would not be able to deploy any more cells until you move this back up into that ample funding box, and then you could deploy more cells. Now, if cells were already deployed, let's say, and this moved down, that's okay, you don't need to return them, but you need to take that into consideration if you want to deploy more. This would have to be moved back. Here we have the events in play box. So this is for those event tokens that I talked about. When there's events that will last for longer than a turn, you can place them in the events in play box. There's also various boxes around the board for those specific tokens, such as right here you can see the Abu Sayyaf location. So there is a token here called Abu Sayyaf that you would place into this box, and that has its own box because it primarily affects the Philippines, whereas the ones that may affect the entire board, you can just put in the events in play box. And that leads us here to the terror plots. So the jihadist player starts off with 6 different terror plots, and they have a number ranging from 1 to 3 on the back. And here they can take these terror plots and deploy them into various countries on the board. And if the U.S. player is unable to counter that plot, then it's flipped over and something bad happens. So on the subject of plots, you can see there are also WMD plots. There are 3 WMD plots in this box, called the loose nuke box, and there are 3 more in the Pakistani arsenal, which is down south here a little bit. Through certain events in the game, the jihadist player may be able to take these WMD plots and place them into their available plots box, and thus make those WMD plots available for use during their normal plotting. I'll go a little bit more into how the plots work and what they're used for and what makes a WMD plot different from the standard plots. But I will tell you right now that if a WMD plot is resolved in the United States here without being countered by the American player, the game automatically is over and the jihadist players win, or player wins. Also down in this busy area here is the reserves track. So during the game, you're going to be playing cards for either for their event or for the ops value here at the top. Let's say you really need 3 ops for a particular reason, and that'll make more sense when I go over the actions and how the ops are used. But let's say you need 3 ops, but you just have a handful of 1 ops cards or 2 ops. What you can do is play a card. Let's say I'm the US player, I'll play this card for 2 ops, and I'll put those 2 ops into reserve. And then on my next turn, I could say play a 1 ops card and expend the 2 ops I have in reserve, and then I would have a total of 3 ops, and I could perform a 3 ops action. So that's what the reserve track is for. Down at the bottom we have the victory conditions track. Now the US player will win the instant that Muslim countries with a total of at least 12 resources have good governance. So we have the good resource marker here, and as countries fall under good governance, the resource value of that country is going to cause this marker to move up. So let's just take a quick look at Pakistan here. We can see Pakistan has a resource value of 2. So if the American player was able to get this to a good governance then they would add 2 to the good resources track, and that would bump them closer to the victory condition of having to have 12 resources under the good governance. Now, conversely, this is always a sliding scale, so if that country fell from good to a fair or lower governance level, then those resources would then be lost. Another way for the US player to win is to have at least 15 Muslim countries with fair or good governance. So if any of the 15 of the 18 Muslim countries have a fair or good governance, so either yellow or blue, then they immediately win. And again, that is tracked down here with this particular marker, which says fair/good countries, and that's going to move up here as well. The third way that the US can win is if there are no jihadist cells on any country on the map. So we can see Afghanistan starts with 4 cells, and they're going to be placing more cells throughout the board as the game progresses. If the American player removes all cells from the board at any time, they immediately win. Now, how about the jihadist player? The jihadist player wins the instant Islamist rule governs countries totaling at least 6 resources. Now you can see Afghanistan already starts under Islamist rule and has a resource value of 1. And we can see the Islamist rule resource marker here is at 1. The second this gets to 6, the jihadist player wins. So the American player needs to stay on top of that. Another way is for US prestige to equal 1 and at least 15 Muslim countries having poor or Islamist rule. So similar to the American player wanting to have fair and good countries, the jihad player is going to be wanting to increase the poor/Islamist rule countries, and once that gets to 15, if US prestige is 1, which I'll go over prestige in a moment, then the Muslim player immediately wins. And finally, the third way, which I mentioned a moment ago, is if a WMD plot is detonated in the United States. And this is all listed here in these little boxes. I know it's probably hard to read, but they will tell you the winning conditions in case you happen to forget. And these also have the winning conditions for the single player game as well, so just make sure you're reading the right one. At the top here, you have the play sequence rather. You have just a card token here that indicates who plays what cards, or whose turn it is to play cards. And what's unique about this particular game is during each impulse, each player is going to play 2 cards at a time rather than back and forth one at a time. And the jihadist player always acts first, so they will play 2 cards and they get resolved. Then the US player will play their first and second card, and then any plots that were placed by the jihadist player will be resolved. So plots are resolved quickly, so the US player has to act on them quickly. And then this will reset. We also have the deck marker here. So you can play with either 3, 2, or 1 deck reshuffle. The short normal game of about 2.5–3 hours is with 1 deck. After you get to the point where the deck would be reshuffled, this moves to the end box and the game is over. And if there were no instant victory conditions, that's when you tally up the end of game victory scoring, which I'll tell you in a moment. If you were, say, playing with 3 decks, you shuffle, you move it down, you shuffle again, you move it down, and then to the end. Pretty straightforward. And you also have the end of turn sequence here. So at the end of the turn, jihadists will lose 1 funding. The United States will lose 1 prestige if there's any Islamist rule countries on the board. You'll get +1 prestige under a certain situation. You'll remove any lapsing events. The reserves go back down to 0 because you can't carry over your reserves from turn to turn. And you deal new hands, and the regime change countries change from green to tan. And I'll touch on regime change in a moment. Then back down here we have the prestige track and the global war on terror relations track. So the GWAT track, global war on terror relations, has 2 different components. You have the US and the world. The US can either be hard or soft. Hard or soft. But the world is going to shift. And the way the world shifts is through the posture markers. I mentioned earlier that there's going to be these posture markers placed on the board on the non-Islamist countries. So basically the net value of soft to hard will equal the global war on terror relations. So if there are, say, 5 countries under hard posture, and there are, say, 4 under a soft posture, that is a net of hard 1. And that's actually how the game starts. You can see that Israel, by default, is always a hard posture. And that is why the world always starts at hard 1. And as more are placed on, this is going to change. So if it shifts over to the, will change, and if this shifts to the soft side, this will shift to soft. Now, there are certain events that require the US or the world to be hard or soft, and there's a very bad penalty that occurs if the world is a separate posture from the United States. So if the US is hard and the world is soft, you get a really nasty die roll penalty equal to the difference. So you always want to make sure that you're on the same side as the world in general. And then right below that we have the US prestige track. And this is going to shift throughout the game. And if the US has at least a 7 or above, they're going to get a +1 die roll modifier to their War of Ideas action. And that's the primary operation or action of the US player. And if they're actually at a 10, 11, or 12, they're going to get a +2 to the War of Ideas roll, which makes it a lot nicer. But if they start to fall down into the low, they're going to get a -1. So that's where I was mentioning the victory condition. If the Islamist player has 15 poor or Islamist rule countries and this prestige track is all the way down at 1, then they win the game. Now let's look at the Schengen countries. In Europe, there are several countries that are linked with these symbols. For all intents and purposes, these countries that are linked with the Schengen symbol and say Schengen on them are all adjacent. So Algeria is adjacent to the symbol here, and that thus makes them adjacent to all the other Schengen countries.